Now, the first session, the first panel of the day is, I think, extremely interesting. I do not hide from you that the issue of evaluation and the communication of the work of a corporate affairs department has always concerned me when I was on the other side of the river in the conventional corporate environment. I remember we have always had difficulties, both ourselves and our teams, but also those above us, in defining the indicators, the KPIs, for evaluating our work. This is because the work of corporate affairs cannot be easily quantified. It is differently quantified, as is the case with other departments where things are very clear and their work can easily and by default be quantifiable. I want to say that very often there was a difficulty in internally recognizing the work of a corporate affairs department, which was a source of conflicts and frustration. But why is this happening? What are the implications and what can a corporate affairs department do to achieve the recognition it claims and deserves to? In order to enlighten us on all this, I thought of inviting one of the most distinguished and experienced experts, corporate affairs experts in Brussels, Alan Hardacre, former senior corporate affairs executive in a multinational firm and co-founder of the consultancy Advocacy Strategy Academy in Brussels. After Alan's presentation, you will be able to ask him questions with the coordination and the kind care of another seasoned and experienced and dearest corporate affairs professional and colleague, Romína ΣΙΑΤΕΡΛΗ. Alan, please, join us. You have the floor.
Kalimera. That will now switch to English. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for the invitation to come and speak to you today on this subject, which I came to understand probably quite late in my corporate career was something I should have paid much more attention to much earlier in my career. And it starts with a question. If I ask every single one of you right now what success looks like in your job, I don't know how many of you are here, say there's 50 of you here, I will get 65 different answers. Okay? Now, that in itself is actually quite good. That shows the richness. None of us do exactly the same job in this room. We all do slightly different variations of the same thing. And we all work for different organizations. But the fact that we will articulate our success in 65 different ways is also, I believe, a big problem. Now, if I ask you questions, are you clear? Is your organization clear what success looks like in your field? Are they really clear about how you contribute to the business? Maybe you can say yes. My suspicion is that many of you maybe can't say yes to that question with 100% certainty. I'm then going to ask you, so how do you measure that success? How do you actually say that it was successful? How do you demonstrate it? Do you have any data to prove it? Could you maybe even put that in financial terms? Okay, I have a lot of questions I could ask you. I didn't come here just to ask you questions, be reassured. I came here to try and walk you through why I think this is so important. And I'm going to pick up then on what Andreas said, perhaps at the very beginning. This is something that I learned the hard way, I guess, why this was so important. So I've been in Brussels for about 25 years. I've worked for trade associations, I've worked for think tanks, and I've worked in the corporate world. In my corporate life, when I arrived in the first multinational that I worked for, I went to a regional sales meeting and I was introduced on my first day as a master of the dark art. Because my predecessors had done a very good job of explaining to everybody in the company that what we did was ridiculously complicated. Now, I understood that that served a very good purpose for them personally. If everything was very complicated and in a grey zone, they could always get their annual bonus. Because it was easy to argue that they had achieved everything they set out to achieve because they had very, very blurry objectives. Influence public opinion. Did you do it? Yes, I did. There we go. That was the conversation. So I inherited that, and I didn't think too much about it at the beginning. I carried on my corporate life until the day that Andreas mentioned, where my board member introduced me to the board as the director of cocktail affairs. I went home that day feeling probably the most professionally deflated I've ever felt in my life. It was insulting to me that I was trying to professionalize what I do, and that was the view. So I spent the next part of the year being very angry at my board and my senior management team because they didn't understand me. It then sort of, I realized, actually, no, the problem is not them, the problem is actually me, because I need to educate them on what it is I actually do. If they don't understand, I can't expect them to suddenly miraculously come in one day and say, actually, I know what the corporate affairs department does, because they really did not know. So that has basically been my journey, and now I try to help people understand all of the weird and wonderful things that a public affairs professional, a corporate affairs professional today needs to do internally to succeed. So we talk about evaluation here, and I think evaluation for me then, what we're really going to look at is what is success, how do you measure it, and then how do you communicate this to an organization in a way that means something. Okay? Now, there's good news and there's bad news as we go through this. The good news is that I think collectively, individually, we can all get much better at this, and there are some very clear ways that we can do this. The bad news is it takes time, it takes effort, and you don't turn around the understanding of other people in your organization in the space of days or weeks. It takes a much longer period of time over which you need to establish something, deliver on it, and build over time. So what I put here is, and this cuts across everything. This is the premise of all of the work you will do, how you will be recognized, how you will articulate what you do, from the very beginning of setting up a campaign to getting your objectives and your KPIs. It's then going to help you understand the processes and the ways of working. I put here that it's an iterative profession because I'm assuming that as corporate affairs, public affairs, communications professionals, these are the things that we love about our job. It's always changing. The politics changes, the environment changes, the issues change, the profession is changing. And last but not least, of course, our organizations change. They change their mind all the time. So we have lots of change, and our job is to try and manage all of that. Now, when it comes to the communication bit, and also the first bit, this was never in my job description. All of my job descriptions, and I did understand the few English words in the previous session where in some of the job titles, I always had external in my job title, even when, in fact, I spent 98% of my time working internally. Yes? So I had a job title that had listed lots of external things that I was expected to do, but in reality, I actually spent 98% of my time fighting with my own organization. Why am I here? What am I doing? Why do I need resources? What can this campaign bring to the business? Can I educate this senior manager? So there was the need to communicate is educate, recognition, and visibility. And that is premised off a clear articulation of what this contribution is. Now, part of that is a professional and for the function and for you to leave this to your successor with a clearer understanding in your organization of what you do. But it's also about your own professional development and your own profile. Now, there are different ways to evaluate, and actually, as it happens, I was at an event in Brussels this week where there was a discussion about the main ways, and I'm trying to find it here, the main ways that people evaluate success in public affairs. So the first one is unsurprising. The first way public affairs professionals evaluate success is, did you meet your objectives? Okay, pretty standard. Most of us have objectives. We're evaluated on them at the end of the year because what really counts there is what's in your objectives. Okay, and here I can give you some examples. When I first arrived in Brussels, I had objectives like improve your network. increase your visibility, increase our reputation. Okay? All very nice. They're all relevant in some way. I completely agree. When they're phrased like that, of course, I could claim that I have succeeded in all of them. Okay? So I think it is possible to take those objectives and turn them into something that is more quantifiable. Now, at the event the other day, there was the European Director of Public Affairs for McDonald's. And he was asked, okay, give us an example of a very good objective that you give your team in Europe. And he said, okay, I will give you an objective that we use in his team. And I thought it was a very good one. So he said, okay, so we all have an objective related to stakeholder engagement. So what we do is we break the objective down and we say for a team member, you will meet 10 of the key stakeholders on your list A of priority stakeholders on your file at the right time in the next 6 months. And they update all of their objectives every 6 months. So they're much more focused and deliberate. And then he said the second thing we do for that stakeholder piece, we link it to a file. Okay, and this becomes critical, and this is going to be the big, it's very simple, but the big thing that we're going to come to in a second that holds this together. So you can take your objectives, you can turn something that is quite generic into something that is quite concrete. So that was the first one. The second one is to measure success is to do an internal stakeholder satisfaction or perception survey. So your internal stakeholders, we often think about external, but if you're trying to succeed in your corporate affairs life, often your internal stakeholders are much more important than your external stakeholders. So the internal survey, obviously then we're into the world of surveys, so we need a baseline, we need to see progress. The next one on the list was legislative wins or losses. So many of us work in the world of legislation or even communication slightly perhaps different, but okay, legislative wins and losses can be tracked quite easily. Did we get the change in the law that we wanted? Did we delay it? Did we stop it? What was the objective? Did we receive it? You can kind of quickly put that together. You can go one step further, and this is very now much more Americanized. A lot of American companies do this, is they will look at what is the financial cost that was mitigated. Okay? Now, most of us in this room as public affairs or communications professionals, at least maybe I'll put this on myself, when I joined the profession, I imagined myself doing lots of proactive stuff. Yeah, I somehow thought corporate affairs was about going out and changing things for the better. I soon discovered that, in fact, another one of the names in my company for public affairs was the fire department. Why? Because we would be called on when there was an emergency, or I would be notified when absolutely categorically it was too late to do anything. So, yes, I then tried to have to work, okay, which is good. You're a risk mitigation function. So what you look at is, okay, what's the value, the quantified value in dollars of the risk we're mitigating for my organization? You can do that. Now, if you want to get your organization really excited, you could talk about the revenue that you could actually generate. Now, this starts to get dangerous because now you start to sound like a marketing or a sales department, but this is also where you cross a bridge that gets much more interesting. So you can quantify, if possible, the risks that you're dealing. Then we come to some other ways of measuring your work, which would be media coverage, sentiment analysis, external stakeholder satisfaction, general public perception. Yeah, there's lots of other ways to measure. Now, the reason I'm putting these out there is because I think they're very important. But what we first need to do is we need to make a key distinction, because it was another one of the things that I really learnt in my journey of mistakes in the corporate world, in trying to explain who I was and what my function did, is I needed to separate out between the what and the how. Okay? So the what became, what is it that the business wants me to do? What is it that my organization wants me to do? And my organization often would want me to stop a law, okay, which would then have to become a conversation to explain that, okay, you don't just stop laws, it doesn't just happen like that. Maybe we can change something in the law, yes, and it might take 1 year, it might take 3 years, but okay, so change was my business. So, okay, the what could then be ideally articulated in 3 iterations. What is the absolute desirable outcome? Yeah? Remove this substance from Annex A. What would be an acceptable B or C, so that I could have something realistic to work to in a 1, 2, 3 order for every objective as a what? Now, the reason I separate from the what, because then you need the how. The how are all the different things that you are then going to do to achieve the what. That's your media work, sentiment analysis, stakeholder meetings. That's everything you do. Now, the reason I separate the two out is because I discovered that my business could not care less about the how. They are fixated on the what. That's why I am there. I also discovered that trying to explain to them my how confused them. If I kept telling them, well, we had a great event last week, often came with the same question. So what? Who cares? Yeah, now you understand maybe I understand maybe where the Cocktail Affairs name came from. After explaining so many times that we'd had successful meetings, dinners and events, at some point somebody put 2 and 2 together and thought that perhaps that's all you actually do. Why? Because we were so busy telling them how we did things, we were not telling them what this was about. So this was absolutely a big switch moment for us to only communicate to our business. We could explain the how, a big success, but was always categorically linked to the what. So that there was always the link between we had this successful event, which was one step of a 20-step plan towards achieving this, which is worth X dollars to the company. Okay, so always trying to create the linkage so that it was very, very clear to them. Now, I'm trying to clear out everything up front here. So the next thing I want to say is that, of course, we work in a fantastic field, as I've already said. So there are certain limitations to what we can discuss and how we can measure our work and our success. Now, the first big limitation is what I would call attribution. Okay, what I mean by that is, okay, so if a law, something changes in a law, who actually did that? Did you do it? Now, let's be honest. Let's have a moment of honesty in this room. How many of us have sat in an annual meeting or an appraisal somewhere and looked our boss in the eye and said, that was me? Changing the law? Absolutely my campaign. Okay? Okay? I have certainly sat there. Okay? So there is attribution. How do we know whether what we did was us or not? Sometimes it's clear. Sometimes it's really clear. Yeah, you wanted something super specific and you can show, look, there's the email with the amendment I suggested and oh, look, here's the final text. It was me. Okay? Often it's not quite so straightforward. The second challenge we have is what I would call, I could diplomatically call this the long-term challenge. You could look at this at the fact that commercial businesses have the attention span of a fly, which basically means most commercial businesses are obsessed by literally these days a 3 to 4 week rolling horizon. And if you're working in a longer horizon, it becomes very difficult to relate one to the other. Okay? It's difficult. It was always difficult when the business did an annual planning cycle, and of course, public affairs work doesn't run in an annual cycle. So that's a second challenge. The third challenge, I think, is one of the most difficult things that we as public affairs professionals have, which is why some of the ways that we measure and evaluate becomes so important. You can do everything right. You can set up a what, change the law, change this clause in this law by this date, and you can set out a how. All of the things you need to do, meet all of these people, everything step by step. You can do everything on the how right and still not get what you want. Okay? That is the joy of public affairs. You can be blindsided at the last minute. We have to work in our life with politicians. Okay? Which obviously is an interesting group of people. I'm going to stay diplomatic today. It's an interesting group of stakeholders to work with who are unpredictable at best. Okay? So it's challenging that you can do everything right on the how and still get the what wrong. Obviously, the opposite is true. You can do everything wrong and still get exactly what it is you were looking for. Why? You probably don't even know. Okay? So the separation between the what and the how can help you tell a story as to getting everything right on the how. It is actually very good for you and your organization. You didn't win this time, but you have a chance of winning next time. Which is, I guess, then The next sort of limitation that I think we have as a profession is we need to, when we're talking about success, what we want and how we achieve it, we need to manage, I think we need to balance more quantitative with qualitative. Okay, so we need to balance out the two sides between some data. Did we hit this target? Did we have those meetings? Did we see an uptick in influence or impact? We can do this. Can we quantify the risk that we're mitigating? Yes, we can. But still, the world we work in, also anecdote and story are still very important. So it's not about throwing out the anecdote, it's about giving it its right place. And then maybe one last limitation is there is not a one-size-fits-all. I think there is lots of good practice here, there's almost a framework, if you like, that you can use. But if you're an association, you probably use it a bit differently to a corporate. And then if you're in the corporate world, you still have to tailor it to every corporate has its own language, right? Every organization has its own way of doing things and saying things. So everything still needs to be tailored. So I wanted to set that out as a little bit of the main ways that I think you can measure, some of the limitations, and now I'm going to go back to the presentation that I've deviated from ever so slightly as a sort of a 10-minute interlude, but I will cover now back some of the ground that we've discussed. So ultimately, a lot of what we do is about how do you measure influence. We are in the business of influence. That's what we do. Okay? Whether in communications or public affairs, we are trying to influence something. Ultimately, there's the objective, the what, but in that, there's a lot of different steps of influence for the how. And there are different ways of trying to measure that. And I think it's important that we all have a think about how we can do this a little bit more professionally. And that's what I mean by iterative. I don't think actually most organizations would be ready for us to move from perhaps the way we measure and articulate success today to the most professional version. My organization certainly wasn't ready for this. It was a 4-year journey to move them from, meet 10 stakeholders. I mean, what the hell does that mean? Meet 10 stakeholders. Who? Why? To actually having something that was a bit more meaningful. So, and this then links the tighter you are with articulating success and understanding what measures you can use on the what and the how, the better you can then evaluate. Okay? You can evaluate what you achieved, but you can also evaluate the how. Because that's maybe another joy of our profession, is you're working on 2 files. Okay? You find something works really well on one file, it doesn't for 1 second mean that it will work well on what you do next. Everything is a product of time and space in the public affairs world. You hold a great event and you think, that's a great format, I'll do that again. And the second time it doesn't work. And you think, why not? I wonder why that didn't work. Okay, so it's very circumstantial. So the ability to evaluate, and here, going back into evaluating what you do is, of course, premised on where you set yourself up. And here, in the evaluation, evaluating what you did, evaluating then where did you spend your money what were you spending money on? Most public affairs people have ginormous, big, red flashing budget items called trade associations. Okay? Are we evaluating if we're getting value for money from our trade association? Did they deliver? How did they link to what we were doing? Are we using lobbyists? Did I set any KPIs or data-driven basis into my contract with my lobbyists, for example? So again, this type of thinking permeates then everything we do. Now, probably I'm frightening you now at the thought of how much hard work this could all be, but I said it's very iterative. Small steps will take you a long way. Now, I talked about these a little bit in some of the main ways of measuring your public affairs work. So I've had a lot of times where I've been asked to have an objective that would be improve our perception amongst our key stakeholder group in Brussels, for example. Okay? It's a very good, very noble objective, but of course, we wanted to do that quote unquote cheaply. Okay? That means that we wouldn't go to Ipsos or somebody else and actually do a survey to ask people. We would kind of do it as a feeling. Okay? How do you think it went this year? Oh, I think it went very well. Okay? not very productive, not entirely professional, somewhat surprisingly acceptable, but nonetheless something that could change. So there is value in these things, but I think the value only comes the moment you get above a certain professional bar. Legislative win-losses is a very good place to start. Okay, this then comes to one of the other biggest challenges that I think many of us have, and maybe I will therapeutically open this, but if I talk to any public affairs professional today, they tell me they have too many priorities. In the world of public affairs, communications, ESG, sustainability, if everything's a priority, nothing's a priority. So here, in a legislative win-loss scale, you need to understand what's the priority order that you're working from. And then you can drive some data with your organization to find out what your priorities are. Costs avoided, costs reduced. This is actually putting a financial figure on all of the files you're working on and then telling your organization, I mitigated this risk. Now, that is fantastic. I think this is a great first step. I made a very painful learning. I worked with my organization for 18 months to build a discounted cash flow financial model that would evaluate for every piece of core legislation, the top 20 priorities that my organization was facing, we costed up what that could mean for the business. We were into the hundreds of millions. Okay, so when we had a big win, I was very happy to sit with my executive team members and say, this week, as a corporate affairs function, I'm proud to tell you that we delayed this law for 18 months, which has saved the business $15 million. Okay? What I discovered was that success lasted about 35 seconds. Why, I discovered, is because I was talking about something that had never happened. It had never touched the bottom line of the company. It didn't add anything to the bottom line. It didn't take away some pain. I discovered it was a little bit like saying to somebody, I'm going to give you an aspirin now because you may have a headache later. At the moment, they're like, oh, thank you, that's very nice. Afterwards, when they don't get a headache, they're like, well, actually nothing happened. The next day, they're like, why the hell did I do that? So it was a very short-term thing, but it's a very good place to start because what it did was at least it allowed me to talk the same language as everybody else in my business. I sat at executive team meetings for 4 years where everybody talked numbers and I talked stories. To say that didn't fit in is an understatement. So at least when I could start talking numbers and say, yes, we're managing 20 million of risk in the Greek market in the next 6 months, it actually made a difference. People actually, for once, listened. Now, the end of the story wasn't exactly what I was hoping for. Where it did get interesting was when we could say that we could create opportunity. Now the business would get excited because we were actually going to add something to the bottom line. I'd say revenue created. I would also say crisis averted in here because I'm hoping that many of you have discovered that one of the best ways to push corporate affairs, communications agenda in your business is when there is a crisis. There is nothing better than a crisis to help us in our world explaining what we do and making our businesses understanding how valuable that can be from. Never underestimate the value of a good crisis. So the reason why a crisis and revenue created are the same is because it actually hurts somewhere or it gives a bottom line impact. Now, the problem is, most of us, or at least in my life, I spent 165% of my time reacting to things, dreaming for the little bit of time I had left about all the proactive things I would like to do, but that were last on my list because I had everything I needed to react to and I didn't have enough resource and I could never quite make the right business case for why I should go from one to the other. So again, this one might help with the other. Of course, if you're getting into numbers, you can start to talk about return on investment. How much do you pay for this function? What's the return on investment? Again, you're starting to talk like the other functions in the business. Now, that's on the what. If you move to the how side, I wanted to flag two things. I'm not going to go over the details, but getting into more of a systematic way of evaluating where you then spend your money, because I assume most of you are then often challenged on your budgets. I know that every budget cycle I will be challenged. Associations were like a red flashing light. Why do you spend $500,000 on this association? Well, okay, actually maybe I need to think about that. And I need to evaluate my own associations and come up with a plan every year for how to improve things. That also goes for your lobbyists. It goes for basically the main areas of where you spend your money. You can be a little bit more data-driven and measurement-focused on how to do this. That's the first half. Don't worry, I will make the second half shorter than the first half, because the next part of this then is how do you then communicate this value into your organization? Now, communicating your value will never be in your job description. It will not be in your objectives. It may not actually ever even be discussed with you, but it is an absolutely critical part of your role. And it's one that I think that people should spend time and energy, especially if you have a team, thinking about how do you do this. So the point being, you can't expect your internal stakeholders to understand what it is you do and what you think you could do for your organization if you're not telling them consistently over and again. Now, the good news here, of course, is that we're lobbyists and communicators. So we're turning all of the skills that we're supposed to direct to the outside world, we're just turning it around and putting it all back on our own organization. With my team, we had a stakeholder map, key position papers and messages for all of our internal stakeholders. With my senior team, we then divided up, okay, these are the 10 key people in the business that we need to talk to. You're taking those 3, you're taking those 3, and basically we went to work. Okay? What messages do we need to pass? How do we need to say this? We made sure that we were consistent, we fed back, we spent time and energy trying to educate people on what it is we did and how we did it. And that was often then based around the articulation, always the articulation of the what. Okay? What it is we would contribute. So if we were talking to the marketing director, what she would want to know is, what are you bringing me? How are you making my life easier? Are you mitigating something? Are you opening something? Why should I even care? Why should I let you into my office, quite frankly? So that was the premise. Everyone we spoke to, we would have to think about how we are in some way making their life better. That was the way we went about it, because every other seat in the executive team that I sat with had what I would call a management school seat at the table. Okay? So if you go and do any form of MBA, go to any big management school, you will learn about sales, marketing, HR. You will probably not learn anything about public affairs and communications. Okay? So everybody else had a de facto seat at the table. The corporate affairs communication seat tended to be the needs to be justified or understood seat, and that was how we wanted to go about it. So the first thing that we would communicate would be our objectives. Okay, so what, again, I'm going to keep saying it, I'm sorry, in fact, I'm not even going to be apologetic about it because it's so important. We would consistently tell them where we were against the what and the contribution to the business and their individual life. We would put round monthly circulars. We created beautiful dashboards that we would send them so they could consistently see what it was. Okay? We separated out because then the how was very important for us as professionals. So we would share that amongst ourselves. Yeah? Because we would appreciate, if we send a message around in our public affairs team that someone had managed to get an amendment through a difficult vote at a challenging time, we would all recognize what a great achievement that was. We wouldn't put that to the business because it would just raise more questions than it would give answers, because it was a step on a very long process line. And then we decided that actually maybe that's not enough. Maybe we need to do more. So we can tell them where we are against what it is we're doing and trying to relate our value to the organization, but it's not enough. Because maybe you also come across another phenomena. I wouldn't pretend to know what the job of my chief financial officer is. I would never go into the office of my chief financial officer and give financial advice. I'm not sure you're doing that, right? Wouldn't dream of it. Every single other executive in that executive team, however, did not have the same view for me. They were always very happy to come into my office and tell me how they thought I should be doing things. Pick up the phone, give him a ring. Surely you can sort this out. Everybody had a view on how to do my job. Okay? And that was very difficult. And we thought, okay, if everybody has a view on my job, but none of them actually understand what my job is, again, I have got some work to do. So we tried to run workshops with different management teams. And we used cases. And we tried to get over the fact that, it's not a cocktail affairs. It's not a dark art. There's a process. We have a plan. Look at the plan. trying to show them that this is actually a professional organization, very much like their own. Okay? Again, over time. So we were trying to do this in every one of our markets around the world. We created little kits that they could do. We offered them space. You know, some markets, they had all staff lunches. Free drink and food always attracts more people, they discovered. So free lunches where all staff could come and say, look, we're working on a big problem right now in the French market. Okay? How would you do it? So they'd ask people, how would you do it? You get past the 5 minutes of people saying, well, I'd phone the minister, all the obvious stuff that, you know, of course, you'd never thought of. So once you got past that, you could actually get into what you were going to do and how you were going to do it. And actually, out of those sessions, it became very interesting because suddenly you'd have people in these meetings who would say, oh, actually, my brother is the minister's chief of staff. And you're like, okay, you think to tell us that now? You didn't think about this earlier. So again, it was a very good way of connecting and mobilizing the organization around something that mattered, a what, but that brought it to life. So again, just if I put all of that into one very big, lots of click picture, we did lots of different things to try and engage our organization. And this was iterative. We didn't start with this, but we kept realizing that we were not doing enough. Again, and I can state very clearly, by the way, that none of this was in any of our objectives. It was in none of our job descriptions, but we realized that to be successful, this was what it was going to take. We were organizing webinars, giving updates. We created the format of the updates. We were doing public affairs days, workshops. We were running academies for general managers. We were running academies for the marketing department. In our big organization, we always had to do mandatory training. It was usually compliance related. We managed to sneak some public affairs modules in there that everybody had to take, so they get a bit more of a flavor. Every company has an intranet. We decided we needed a bit more presence. We created a public affairs app. Okay, so first and foremost for the public affairs team, so you'd have everything on your phone on the go, but also for general managers, for other people who would need our key messages. We wanted to show value all the time. And then making sure that we were everywhere we needed to be in our organization. And actually reversing our thinking on a lot of things. We all had to do far too much internal reporting, and we all hated it. So we tried to do the mental switch and actually think, okay, I'm going to see this as an opportunity, not as the waste of time I've always considered it to be. So we would then use this as a constant opportunity to tell our story. We came up with dashboards like this one, where we tried to put down what are the different countries, what are the different issues. My senior executives loved the traffic lights, okay, so always had to have traffic lights. What was the size of the prize, what was the financial implication? Show on the right then what's our overall contribution to the business, again in numbers, but not losing, as you'll see, the future foundations, we wouldn't lose the how. Okay, so we would also showcase some of the major successes we'd had so that we were also telling them a little bit about how we were doing things. So, I think that brings me pretty much to the end of the presentation. So I will perhaps move over to the sofa. Is that the... Exactly, the hosts.
Yes. Alan, wow. What a presentation. Why? I can speak. Yes. So, I don't know, I hope I'm speaking on behalf of everyone when I say that your presentation felt like going to the spa and the gym at the same time. So, it was spa because somebody finally understands you, makes you feel good about what you're doing, you know, relaxes you, and then suddenly, boom, you know, the gym. You have to do things more, you have to do things better, you have to do things more business-like, right? So, thanks very, very much. I know I spoke to a couple of colleagues here while you were doing your presentation, and they said that they feel like you're holding up a mirror against our jobs, our professions. So thank you, and I would like to ask if anybody has any questions to start the conversation.
Come on, guys.
Don't be shy.
That's the time.
Anyone? I can fire away if nobody wants to start. Okay, so I've written a few things here. First of all, I think everybody agrees that we need to have the outcomes as opposed to the outputs, the what's versus the how, right? And they need to be clearly written down and agreed with the management. How do you account for the potential reputation risk of any of these objectives leaking to the public and causing, taken out of context and causing potential reputation risks. I'll give you an example, We've had companies in Greece whose stakeholder engagement plans or their objectives leaked, were photographed, taken to the public, in whatever shape or form, and they created even more issue. We started to be seen as even more masters of the dark arts, right? Yep. We're Slytherins. So how do you balance between having your objectives on one hand, clear objectives, and managing the reputation risk around them being known to the outside world?
Yeah, I think there's also a very famous image in Brussels that once circulated, and it was from Coca-Cola. And it was an issues map that Coca-Cola had put out, and they had, I think, 50 issues on this map, and it said impact on the business, and I think it was urgency or when this was going to happen. And they'd mapped these 50 issues out. It was from a public affairs professional perspective, when you see this, you think, wow, this was fantastic. But what they had done, underneath, they'd underlaid what they were going to do in the 4 quadrants of their image. Okay, so it was kind of monitor, and at the bottom they'd put fight back and destroy. Okay? Now, again, in this room we would understand what that meant and why that was there. In the public domain, that didn't go down very well. Okay, so I completely hear you that there probably needs to be a balance between being able to clearly articulate in a way, and we were told, very much along the lines that you're perhaps going, that we should always assume that everything we write, every email we write, every internal memo we send could end up in public. So we were constantly reminded and told that everything we write should be done in a way that if it was on the front page of the newspaper, we could stand behind it. And we had to make some choices there when you come to these objectives. Delay a law. We decided, okay, we can stand behind this. We can stand behind that if it goes public. Yeah, so it was more about toning down the language than it was about changing the essence of what we wanted to do.
Right. That's clear. Thank you. Any other questions before I move on to my next one? Yes?
Based on your great experience, do you think that there is companies from your helicopter view, there is companies which they do better than others? And if this is the case, what is the explanation? Is it because of the nature of the industry? It is because of the company itself? What is the practice in the market?
Better at what?
For doing well, for communicating better, for evaluating correctly their work.
Yeah. So I think clearly some companies are doing better, and I personally couldn't tell you whether this is push or pull. It's probably both, in the sense that the push is where you have public affairs leaders who've done a very, very good job of aligning and engaging their organization in a way that gives them more space and seniority. The pull is, of course, and maybe some of you have experienced this, maybe when you change CEO or you change some key management positions, the position of public affairs and communications can change overnight, for better or for worse. I've had a CEO change that took my public affairs function back 10 years in the appointment day itself. Okay, so there's push and pull. So even if you're professionally doing all of the right things, a little bit like I talk about, you can do everything right in your public affairs strategy and still not get what you want, because you're also depending on a CEO and the management team. The change of a CEO without you doing anything can elevate public affairs massively. And then maybe there's one other trend that I'm not sure if you have this or you're seeing this in Greece right now, is the creation of the role of a chief political officer. So there's quite a few big, again, I'm not going to surprise you when I say mostly American companies are elevating a role that's chief political officer into the board. Because many big American companies are increasingly coming to the realization that at the highest level of the company, they need to work out how they are navigating and managing the external environment. So something is happening, push and pull, but there is definitely a trend to elevating this in companies. And as we see with public affairs, a lot of what starts in the US slowly trickles across the rest of the world.
Okay. Anyone else? I have like a million questions, so we can stay here all day.
It's fine.
Okay. So you talked about setting objectives, agreeing them with management, all good. How do you make sure that these objectives are pragmatic, realistic, and don't take 20 years to achieve? In the meantime, you don't get your bonus.
Yep.
So I know I've worked in several companies in similar roles, and I have felt that sometimes all GMs, CEOs want to hear are the outputs, the how.
Yep.
In other cases, they want to see the what, but they want to see such ambitious whats.
Yep.
That A cannot be, you cannot get the attribution, I did it. It cannot even be done within the remit of one government. You may need to have several governments. So how do you make sure that you get this balance?
Yep.
How do you train your CEO as well to accept
So
this?
I guess I give you two answers to this. So the first is, it really depends again on the organisation you're working with. But to get the right set of what objectives it has to be a very nice alignment between the commercial organisation and you as the public affairs team. So it's not one of these moments where you sit waiting on a Friday and your objectives get sent to you in your inbox and that's it. Yeah, you're not part of the discussion, you're just told what you're doing. That's never a recipe for success. You can actually, we've started doing this. So with 3 pharmaceutical companies in the last 6 months, we've helped them bridge this gap. How? By talking to their commercial business and saying, okay, what are all the risks that you see and opportunities? You know, maybe what are some of the financial numbers next to them? You know, if it hits in this financial year, what does it mean? And coming up with a bit of a scoring on that side. But then talking to the public affairs teams in their markets and saying, okay, how likely is this to happen? How much influence do you think you would have over this? Therefore, you know, what does that mean for you? And then you marry the two together, and then you have a conversation. Okay, sometimes you have to accept that something that you think you've got no influence over is so important that you have to be seen to be trying. Yeah, okay, we've all had it, we all do it, but at least it gives you a sense of that conversation. And then the second thing is, which is the multi-year thing. So what we used to try and do was, you would have risks that run, maybe your biggest risk that you're working for, that your company wants, is running over 4 years. What we would try to do is make sure that we would focus energy on anything small that was happening within one financial year. So we would give disproportionate attention to things by virtue of when they were going to happen, so that we could try to constantly show some contribution. Because if you just focused all your energy on the thing that was taking 4 years, you were going to get questioned on that journey.
Great, thanks. The floor, anyone?
May I?
Yes?
Another question. I'm perhaps abusing of your presence here, but based again on your experience, Alan, I think it would be interesting to share with us what do you think are the most important skills that the corporate affairs executive should have, and what do you believe that what is the ideal profile of a corporate affairs, good corporate affairs executive?
Yep. Okay. I think as I see the corporate affairs professionals, the profession of corporate affairs evolving, and I'm going to talk mostly to the corporate world here because, of course, it's different. If you're running an association, if you're running an NGO, I think that's slightly different than if you're working in a corporate. So I'm going to focus more on the corporate answer here than the other two. I think, and maybe actually it's partially already in what I was talking about when we talk about the creation of chief political officers. A chief political officer actually, I think, is a little bit, that is the highest level that you could go in public affairs in a company, because you would then be finding yourself in the board, helicopter view, and actually it's very interesting to see what the job descriptions of these CPOs are, because a little bit, you're asking me, what does that look like? Well, actually, it's actually written down. So they have a P&L level understanding of their organization, okay? They're financially literate, yeah? Because their role is really to interface between all of the weird and wonderful stuff that's happening in the outside world and the organization, okay? Across all of the external space. So that's the second thing. There's government relations, public affairs, corporate affairs, okay? There's lots of different job titles here. Some of them, different titles, you do the same thing. Some of them, different titles, you do completely different things, okay? But I think what is happening is, you know, if you look at chief political officer, it covers external communications, it covers what you would call government relations, it covers communications, increasingly sustainability and ESG. So I think the key areas that you should be looking at as you're building yourself are some of the adjacent functions, okay? And also, secondly, if there was one thing I would highlight that seems to be critical, is an ability to understand your own business. And I say that because in many countries, many people come into public affairs from all sorts of weird and wonderful angles. And that is no problem. That, where you come from is not an issue at all. It's what you then go on to do. And I think there's probably two things. One is the P&L, and the second is learning the world of a structured, professional, public affairs setup.
Great. I think you've answered two of my questions
Good.
already. One last thing from me. We know that lobbyists, corporate affairs professionals, scholars, whatever, don't have the best image always in the public. I find it troubling explaining to people what I do.
Yep.
In half of the cases, they don't understand what I'm saying, and the other half, they go, ooh,
Yep.
you know, you're the bad guys. Should we, and how, try to change this reputation of our profession?
Yes. So I think we should try, yes. I appreciate it's difficult. I have a 13-year-old daughter. I don't know how many times I've tried to explain to her what I do. One day, I feel that she may understand, and she has sat in so many conference calls in my car that I think she must, by osmosis, becoming a public affairs professional herself. But it is incredibly difficult, and in most places it's negative. And I think the unfortunate thing is, just recently, for example, there was the latest scandal in Brussels was about the Qatar Gate. You probably...
Oh, yes, we know too well.
Okay, yeah, I understand there were some Greek links. Okay, but Qatar Gate is a great example of where you have a government trying to corrupt some MEPs. Okay, and somehow all lobbyists get a bad name from this. The officials, nobody talks about this. All the stories in Brussels were about corruption, lobbyists. It was not about corrupt officials. So I think somehow, and again, obviously, part of the problem here, we all have a responsibility to try and explain, and it starts with what we're doing here internally in your organization to explain what you do better into the outside world, but we will always suffer the same problem. If one of us in this room makes a mistake, we're all going to suffer. That's just the way it is. So we all have a shared responsibility to do better, but we're all going to suffer the same consequence, unfortunately.
Thanks very much. That's all from my side. It's been really a pleasure. Thank you very much for the excellent
Thank you very much.
lesson.
Thank you.